Good day. Today we're going to talk about fascism. I'm going to draw on two books. One book, How Fascism Works, by Jason Stanley, a philosopher. The other book, The Anatomy of Fascism, a professor of, among things, fascism. Fascism is a little bit more complicated than some of the other things we've looked at. Communism is more easy to define. It's like a complete socialism where you have a state in control and you've removed all differences between people. There's no need for wealth. And it's that idea where the people work together to take care of other people. We've talked about the pitfalls of that sort of thinking. Fascism, though, it's tricky, and some historians even say fascism isn't a thing. It's what happened after World War I, and it's specific to that point in history. Jason Stanley takes the point that, no, fascism is a thing. It's a pattern that reoccurs. So that's going to be something that you are going to be trying to figure out. Do you think that fascism was specific to post-World War I, or is fascism something that we can identify today? We need to try as best we can to come up with some of a definition. That's hard to do, but we're going to look at some of the common elements of fascism. So, in history, successful fascist movements, when they succeeded, it was not as much through terror. We think of fascism with this state terror and absolute control, but most of the successful ones didn't start from this just overbearing oppression of force and power that they put upon the people. It was mobilizing the passions of people, the enthusiasm of large groups of people. Think of it as populism. It appealed to so many people that those people found a sense of identity with these ideas and actions. The initial creation of fascist movements often combined doctrine. They had these doctrines that people purported to hold very dear, to believe in, and adherents came to it. But that's kind of the weird thing about fascism, is it has these doctrines, but it's really bad at upholding the doctrines. The actions of fascists are often different than the doctrines. The doctrines are more meant to push people in a direction rather than to lead people, to be an ideal that we try to achieve, this one ideal. It's more provocative in that it pushes people toward an end. Another thing that fascism often has is the exercise of power, the eliminating of competing political parties. So the idea that this party is right or more pure than other parties, and if other parties if we're right, that means other people are wrong, and you don't want wrong people leading you, do you? That would just be dumb. It gets more insidious than that. Often there is some sort of moral ethic. If we are the moral right, well, that implies something about those who oppose us. They're morally wrong. And if they're morally wrong, that means they're evil. And if they're evil, they should be eliminated. So religion has a part to play in fascism as well. There's also, we talked a little bit about this, the emotional appeal of fascism. Fascism was, it's hard to explain really. The fascists who really loved fascism didn't like contemplation, thinking about things. They valued action. They valued quick thinking, common sense, the ability to act without thinking and to be a strong, some people call it leadership, but the people who say, well, I like strong leadership, rarely define what leadership is. They just point at things that they like and say, that's leadership. So they don't like rationality compromise when we see this fascism arise. They don't like anything that will try to use reason to either to denounce them or to check them, to produce things like media that they can't control, or cultural producers, teachers. They're often against the educational system because the educational system, it relies on fact, provable fact. And provable fact is one of those things that the more you amass fact and support and evidence in this scientific process, the more it takes power away from the people, the charisma, and says, no, fact are these things. And the charismatic fascist wants fact to be malleable. They want fact to be whatever they want it to be, and it's frustrating to them when it's a thing written down. So they don't often like journalists, as I said, teachers. Another thing about fascism, it almost always manifests itself as a counterpoint to liberalism. Paxton talks about how it almost can't exist on its own. It is almost always a reaction to a perception of liberalism or fast change or change away from some strangely conceived ideal path or cultural sensibility. And when something aggressively liberal happens from the perception of more traditionalist people, it's seen as the liberalism's gone too far and needs to be brought back to sense. And that is a unifying factor. Fascism is also strongly patriarchal. In fascism, you see this idea of the male conquering hero who uses power to lead, to vanquish foe. There's a lot of sense of there's a foe, and we must defeat the foe. And foe is a strange word. Just say it. Foe. If you say it enough, it doesn't sound like a word. Foe. Anyway, fascism, another reason it's really hard to define is that it's like cobbled together from other things. For instance, fascism is very nationalistic, but it's not nationalism. Nationalism is a different thing. We've talked about what nationalism is. It's very authoritarian, but it's not a traditional authoritarian like a monarchy. So it's different in that sense. It extols strong religion, often Christian religion, but even in extolling these Christian values, it celebrates the dominion of others, and basically they wouldn't use the idea of oppressing, even though that's what it usually comes to. It's this idea of unifying in the power of a Christian empire to vanquish foes, but it never really adopts the Christian ethic of servitude, of humbleness, of the meek. You also see that it is very populist. This is for the people. It's the people's. We are doing this for the people, but it almost always caters to the wealthy, the factory owners. There's a term nowadays called crony capitalism, is forming alliances. It's not we're going to help only the rich. It's we're going to help only the rich people that we like, that see things the way we do. And the idea there is we say we're populist for the people, but we only like the people like us. But don't worry, populist. Since you're like us, that means you're going to be rich because we think the right sort of way. And if you think like us, you'll be rich. And when you get paid, you'll really value the rules we set up that advantage the rich people that we like. You're rich, you just haven't gotten paid yet. And that's kind of how they maintain this weird, there's poverty and populism, and the populists still uphold these leaders who are not really looking out for the people. And for these and more, it's difficult to identify exactly what fascism is, because it's a lot of things, and it's paradoxical. It's hypocritical, even. It unifies, extols this sense of common victimization. So it's often a group that has been historically in power, and yet this group in power feels oppressed. They feel like some other group has been given an advantage. So it's a group with an advantage, and when their advantage starts to slip away, they feel like the victim, even though the people who are starting to get advantage have been victimized much, much, much more than this group in power. And the group in power tends to start seeing themselves as victims. And as victims, they feel justified in violence toward otherness. We're good people. We're decent people. It's just they've been oppressing us for so long that what are you going to do? Eventually, we're going to snap. And boy, did I snap. I showed him, because I'm a man. So we have this weird hypocritical essence to fascism. We also see the authoritarian rule that eventually this caustic attitude and behavior just becomes terrible, and the leadership of this group, it's hard to maintain this idea of absolute bravado, male dominance, right to rule mentality, and it almost always overextends itself to the detriment of the regime, where I tell everybody I'm brilliant, and they believe that I'm brilliant, and if they don't believe that I'm brilliant, I use my power to hurt them, which proves that I'm right, because somebody who got hurt clearly isn't brilliant, which means I'm brilliant by default. And this caustic reality eventually leads to no one who questions the power and authority, and without any feedback, without any questioning, the leadership tends to start diverging from reasonable course to crazy, insane town. So anyway, often we talk about fascism as this is what came after World War I because of, and that's another factor, is there's often some terrible national calamity that befalls people that leads to economic depression that kind of changes how people think. And remember World War I? World War I, people thought they had it figured out. They thought European culture was superior. We have this thing figured out. Those other people, they want to be us. If anyone in the world was going to be happy, they'd be European. And then what do the Europeans do? They blow themselves up and get the Spanish flu, and a bunch of them die, and they realize they don't have anything figured out, and they're depressed, and some have it worse. Germany is oppressed as a result of the end of World War I. Britain and France kind of gang up on Germany, take away their colonies, their resources, force them to pay a huge amount of debt. And so the people of this once proud, think Bismarck, Germany was a proud people under the Second Reich of Bismarck. And then they are dealt a humiliating loss and blamed for it and forced to pay back huge sums of money. And anyone living in Germany at that time, they wished the past was there. And somebody comes along and says, no, I'll make you great again. You can have that former glory. And people were willing to put aside their moral dilemma with some of the process and policies to say, yeah, I'm great. I'm pretty awesome. I'm a man. And I'm going to take back my country. So anyway, what your question is fascism fixed with Mussolini, with Hitler, with Franco, of that time and that era? Or is fascism a pattern of society that we can recognize today? Is it a sequence of events that repeat? And is it something we should be on the lookout today? That's your question. Bye-bye.